school. Played clarinet in the school band.
All right.
But I didn't pursue any kind of proper musical training after that. I basically ignored music until I was a teenager, and then some friends of mine and I discovered punk rock, and we decided we were going to start a band. And that's sort of set the trajectory for the rest of my life.
What sort of bands were you into back then?
Before I started a band myself, I was really pretty ignorant about music. My parents had a record collection, mostly, hillbilly music and some of the folk music from the 60s folk music revival.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was a Johnny Cash fan, so we had, like Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash, Hank Williams, like all the early sort of country icons. And then some, things like the Weavers and the Limelighters and, the early, like, vocal harmony folk revival type groups, the Clancy Brothers and things like, nothing.
Mum and dad stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Tell me about your first band.
The band was called Just Ducky for no good reason. And it was a group of friends more than people who were in a music scene. There wasn't really much of a music scene. I grew up in a small town called Missoula, Montana. I say it was a small town, but it was a college town that's, swelled to something like 40 or 50,000 people during school year. And college towns have kind of a personality sort of worldwide, where young people from all over go to the college town and they bring their record collections with them, and then they slough things off while they're there into the secondhand market there. And that's where locals from the college town get their musical upbringing and exposure, is through the secondhand market of the secondhand record stores. I was somewhat lucky in that Missoula, politically, is a fairly progressive place with respect to Montana, and so it had more than its share of eccentrics and more than its share of libertines and dope fiends and women and that sort of thing.
So your first band, was that a punk band?
We fashioned ourselves a punk band. I don't know that we would have qualified elsewhere, but yeah, I mean we didn't. None of us had an extensive record collection, but the record collections that we did have were all the hard rock of the day, as informed by our peers, and then also what punk rock we could get either secondhand or mail order through the.
Did you get to do any gigs in the band?
Yeah, we did one gig at a high school, which was written up in the local paper as a disaster. We did one gig at a college party in, I want to say, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and then we played like a house party at somebody's house, and we played one gig at a bar, during which something like $500 worth of damage was done to the bar. The band was a disaster on all fronts. Literally nothing about the band that worked well.
Right.
We were bad musicians. We had no peer group. There was no audience for it, and we were unsuccessful at starting a scene. So, there was literally nothing about it worked well, but it was a good inoculation against criticism, because the 4 or 5 of us in a little group that started the band and also to sort of maintain friendship as a peer group, that half dozen or dozen people that we were in our circle of friends, like, we've all remained in contact with each other. We were all vindicated by the fact that all the music that we hated was in fact awful, and all the music we liked was in fact great.
Well, I first became aware of your work through Big Black, and it absolutely blew me away. Just the completely unique sound. First thing I'd heard anything like that at all. So did you have any sort of manifesto at all when you started the band?
No, I mean, I'll be honest. In Big Black, I was ripping off a lot of the bands that I idolized, and so I'm pleased that we synthesized something that came off as unique and original. But my influences when I started the band were pretty much the coin of the realm of the underground music scene at the time. Like, if this would have been 78, 79, 80. So before hardcore punk was in full flight,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there were some bands approximating what became hardcore, but most of my peers, most of my friends, were informed by all the early punk rock and then all of the experimental music that was concurrent with it. So things like Public Image and Perubu and Chrome and Factrix and Throbbing Gristle and Tuxedo Moon and The Residents and Cabaret Voltaire and, you know, Italo Urbane, a French band that were enormously influential on me because they were the first punk band that used a drum machine, you know, that maintained the aggression of punk, but incorporated, you know, like elements of modernism or contemporary technology. And so, like, I idolized all of those bands, and so I stole things from all of them somewhat relentlessly. And I'm pleased that the synthesis of it came off as unique and original. But I'm aware of the, you know, me copying the minimalism of a band like Cabaret Voltaire, or me copying the processed perversion of a band like Chrome, where the instruments and voices were all crudely recorded, but then further deranged intentionally. Or a band like Perubu, who, while they clearly had rock band or punk rock heritage, and, you know, the DNA of their music was there, they also had an abstract element that eschewed conventional song form and, you know, conventional subject matter, and, you know, they had presentation that approximated Dada or situationist confrontational approaches. Like, all of that stuff was all very, you know, that was all pungent at the time, and I was stealing bits of all of it.
Did you self-publish Big Ruthless Records, I think, when you were manager there as well?
Well, what happened was there was a group, there was a sort of a cadre of bands in Chicago who were all friends and associates. There's a band called the Effigies, who are probably the most well-organized of those bands.
Mm-hmm.
They actually had a fucking manager. Like, they had a guy that did their business. You know? Then there's a band called Naked Ray Gun, who are another arty sort of experimental punk band in town. And I was in that circle as well. And the three of us kind of banded together and said, all right, well, we're all planning on doing records this year. Let's call ourselves a record label, and then we'll be able to get paid from the distributors easier. That was the problem with independent record releases in America, was that you had to go through a network of record distributors who were all somewhat shady by necessity. You know, like, they weren't getting paid by the record stores either. So, there wasn't like a sort of a monolithic enterprise that you could just drop ship all your records to and have them end up in stores. You had to find individual record distributors for each region of the country and get them to agree to buy your records, and then once they did, you had to get them to pay you. And all of those, each of those things was a separate chore, and rather than having each of the bands try to do that independently, we decided we would just do that as a cooperative. And so, for example, the Naked Reagan put out an EP, and it was, you know, a great record, but they were unknown outside of Chicago. Mm-hmm. But when their record made it out into the stores, it sold. So they were owed money from the distributors. The distributors, unless you have another record that they want, like, unless they want more of that record and they want to restock on it, or unless you have another title that they want, they have no reason to pay you, right? So they know that you don't have the wherewithal to go after them legally. So you have to have an incentive for them to want to pay you.
Right.
And our incentive was, well, okay, you sold those Naked Ray Gun records. We have this Effigies record coming out, and I'm sorry I can't ship you any of them until you make good on this invoice for the Naked Ray Gun. So then you'd get a check for the Naked Ray Gun records, and then they would order the Effigies record, and you send it to them. Same deal with the Big Black record. And the idea was that as long as the three of us bands were gonna continue putting out our own records, and it wasn't a record label in the conventional sense. There was no budget. Nobody got any money, or we never spent any money. You know, any money that was spent on advertising was sort of ad hoc. Like, hey, can I get $20 so that we can buy a quarter page in Coolest Retard, which was the local fancy, and then everybody would chip in $20, and then we'd buy a quarter page in Coolest Retard, and then we'd have a list of all, you know, an email address, or a mail order address and all that sort of stuff. So it was completely ad hoc. It was really poorly organized. It was not a functioning business, but it did allow the three of us as its bands to get a little bit more cooperation from the rest of the independent music business.
Right.
From the distributors and record stores and stuff.
The first Big Black record, Atomizer, and that seemed to me to be a bit more, there was a fuller sound to it, it was less minimalistic. Was that a conscious break from the minimalistic style, or was it just like a natural evolution?
Well, the first Big Black record, I recorded myself on a 4-track, and that's a necessarily limited arrangement. You know, you have 4 tracks to play with. You're doing it by yourself, so you know it suits minimalism, right? Then for the next record, I actually recorded in a proper studio the live band that had formed around that first record, and that live band was me, Santiago Durango, and Jeff Pizzati. And then we also incorporated a live drummer on that second EP, which is called Bulldozer. And he was a friend. He never played live with the band. He only rehearsed with us once. But the drum machine I had at the time was extremely limited, and though it suited the sort of apartment scale music that I was making on the first EP, it was insufficient really for playing with the live band. So we did use it for gigs, but I had been introduced to another drum machine by a guy named Steve Bjorklund, who was in another band in Chicago called Breaking Circus. He had been in a punk band called Strike Under, who were a really terrific, really aggressive, abrasive punk band. But he had, made a bunch of enemies and skipped town and came back and holed up in an apartment with a drum machine and started making music not dissimilar in program to what I was doing in Big Black in a band called Breaking Circus. And I quite liked Breaking Circus. But he had a drum machine. He found a drum machine that had digital samples of real drums called the Drumulator. And as soon as I heard that, I realized that it would be perfect for what I was doing in Big Black. And so I borrowed his drum machine on occasion for gigs and for recording, and eventually saved up enough money that I could buy my own. They were fairly expensive proposition at the time. They're approaching $1,000. It was $700 or $800 for a Drumulator. And I mean, and that was at a time when you could buy a new car for $5,000. So it was pretty big. In today's money, it would probably be the equivalent of $8,000 or $10,000 in scale in terms of what you'd have to, the kind of sacrifices you need to make to get it. So that was pretty substantial investment. And then I set work on learning how to run it, and I learned the intricacies of it to the extent that I was pretty fast so long. Like I could get around on that drum machine pretty easily. And then we started incorporating features of the drum machine into the live sets. Like there was a way that you could program a song sequence into the drum machine so that you wouldn't have to stop and enter the song location for each song. Like you could literally program a set of music and it would play all of the songs and whatever, you'd play a song, and when you finish the song you hit a button with a foot switch and it moves to the next song, and then you play the next song. That whole deal.
Oh, I see.
So that made life a lot easier for us as a touring band. Like, we didn't have to solve any of the sort of technical problems that a lot of other bands did when they had a more complicated electronic setup. Like, you literally give the sound man 4 outputs from the drum machine, and that's your sound check done. And then you have 2 buttons on the floor, and that does your set pacing for you right there. So that was pretty great, the way that was all worked out very quickly. The progression of music was partly facilitated by us getting our own Drumulator, partly facilitated by us all being young and having very few responsibilities. Because, like when you're in college or, working the kind of jobs that you work straight out of college where you're not on a career path. You're just earning a living while you're doing all the important things in your life.
Yeah.
When you're in your 20s, you have evenings and weekends to do whatever you want. You get the occasional vacation from work. How glorious is that? You don't have to. It's just such a terrific time to explore all that stuff. Everyone around you is doing things. All of it's exciting. Everybody has spare time. everything about it was just conducive to us being very prolific during that period. The mid to late 80s was a very productive period in music in Chicago. There's an awful lot happened here.
Are there any British bands from that time, the sort of post-punk era, like new wave era, that you particularly liked?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that, a lot of the sort of small independent label stuff that really appealed to us here. I was a big fan of a lot of the early 4AD stuff, and I was very fond of Bauhaus. First couple of records are insane. Their singles and their first album are just terrific, inventive records. I quite liked. There was a kind of a goofy punk band on the brass label called the Cravats. I was a big fan of theirs. I loved the Fall. I worshipped Fall. I spent a lot of time listening to their records, trying to figure out what they meant. A lot of the vernacular is uniquely, not just uniquely British, but uniquely Northern working class in the Fall's music. And so, if you're not familiar with any of that stuff, you really don't know what words he's saying a lot of the time. Yeah, very fond of the Public Image, the pop group, Gang of Four, all the usual suspects for someone with my tastes, really.
Yeah, I'm from the north of England myself. You eventually became known as a record producer, but you don't like the term producer.
Well, I mean, there is a definitional distinction between what I do and what record producers do. Mm-hmm. Record producers are they're ultimately responsible for what goes on the record. Mm-hmm. They make all of the artistic decisions. They manage the sessions. In a lot of cases, they're choosing the musicians and the music and making pretty much all of the substantive decisions about the record. That's what the record producer does. I don't do that. I work for bands that are self-contained entities, and as such, those bands that I'm working with, are making all of those decisions on their own. I'm very much an employee of those bands, so it's not just a matter of taste. There is a distinction between the way I approach my work and the way a record producer approaches it.
So, speaking of which, a lot of record engineers seem to have a distinctive style, but you seem to specialise in bringing out the best sound out of a band instead of trying to stamp your own sound onto them.
Bearing in mind that the great majority of the music that I do is performance-based, the band has a performing unit, and they play on stage every night, and they, rehearse in their practice room every couple of nights. Like, they have an identity and a style and a manner of playing. My job, most of the time, is for that band to be set up so that they can do that, and then I record them doing it. That's the bulk of the music recording that I do is done in that fashion. Now, there's always extra stuff added. There's always some degree of abstraction from the basic live performance, but the skeleton of everything I do, or almost everything I do, is a live performance of some kind. So while I pride myself on being pretty flexible and being capable of working with anybody, there is a commonality to a lot of the music that I work on, in that you get the immediate sense of a band performing, or of people playing simultaneously together in a performance environment. So while I don't think I have a sound in the sense of record producers who have a sort of trademark approach or a fixed approach to what they're doing, there is a thread of continuity through a lot of the records that I've worked, and I would be hard pressed to pick it out or to describe it in sort of technical terms. But in a practical sense, I do think that you get the sense of a band performing together from a lot of the recordings that I work on.
At some point, you're probably more well known as a record engineer than you are a musician. When did the transition come about? When did other bands start to come to you too?
Well, I was playing in bands and making records as an engineer, sort of concurrently through the late 80s. I mean, I was semi-professional at both. I didn't make a living as a musician. I didn't make a living as an engineer. I quit my last straight job in, I want to say, 1987, and that I had been working for a company that did photographic imagery for advertising, and I was a retouch artist and a photo composition artist. I would do photo composition assembly of a product in front of a background, or a dude smoking on a motorcycle in front of a mountain, that sort of stuff. And I quit that job in 1987 when I had a bunch of work lined up as an engineer, and I was also starting a new band. Big Black was doing its world tour, its final tour, and then Big Black was doing its last tour, and then I had some work lined up as an engineer after that. So I quit my job, and that was basically it. Like, I've basically just been worked full-time as an engineer after Big Black broke up. I was engineering, and I was in a band called Great Man for a year or so, and then I wasn't in a band for a long time after that, but that was, I would say late 80s, 88, 89, 90. In that era, that period was when I transitioned to being a full-time recording engineer.
So I've got to ask you about Nirvana. What did you think of the group before you worked with them?
I wasn't familiar with Nirvana until their big hit. That was ubiquitous in the manner that people of all generations resent things that are thrust at them inescapably. I'm sure I bristled at that, at being confronted with that record, and every time my band would set up to play a gig, or every time I would go anywhere, that record would be playing, and it was inescapable. I wasn't a fan. There was a kind of a rivalry of sorts between the Seattle scene and the Chicago scene, in that there were some bands from Seattle that people in Chicago admired, and there were some that we thought were kind of stuffed shirts or kind of phony. And I'll admit I didn't really have much of an opinion of Nirvana. Like, I didn't know anything about their music. I wasn't aware of them. I had heard some bits and pieces of their music, but they seemed unremarkable to me. And being frank, their big hit record seemed unremarkable to me. When I got to know them, and I got to work with them, and I got to see them in action, my respect for them grew tremendously, and I now appreciate them as a band dramatically more than I did just as an outside, disinterested observer. They were a great band. I think Kurt was a unique personality, unique talent, and the way the band synthesized the capabilities and the personalities of the three members was great. Yeah, I grew to admire that band greatly.
After Nevermind, because that was a really, really sort of polished, I think it's really overproduced as an album. Do you think that Nirvana wanted to get back to a more sort of aggressive style? Is that why they approached you?
Yeah, I think there's a trajectory that they were under where when they moved to a big record label, they didn't have full control of their affairs more. When, they recorded their album with Butch, and Butch had recorded all their friends' bands, and he recorded all the bands that they liked, and then they were told that someone else had to mix it. They were told that by the record company. It's not a matter of they decided they wanted to make a slicker record. They were told, we're not going to release this record if Butch mixes it. And now, bearing in mind that they had a relationship with Butch, and they liked Butch, and they wanted to, they weren't unhappy with the job Butch did. Mm. And I don't even think the people at the record label had the taste to be able to discern that they were unhappy with what Butch did. It was just pro forma. You had to get a professional mixer to work on a record like that.
Right.
While we were working on the In Utero album, the band played me a cassette of the rough mixes, or the set mixes, that Butch had done of the Nevermind album. And I instantly preferred them to the finished product, like the finished released version. The Butch Vig mixes sounded like all of the records that had inspired them. Like Butch Vig had done all of these records for Killdozer and Laughing Hyenas and De Kreutzen and all of these, chaotic, noisy bands that are full of personality, And when I heard the Butch Vig rough mixes, or the initial mixes of the Nevermind album, I heard that same intensity. I heard that same strength of personality come through. I think they had that kind of record in them all along. I think that the Nevermind was an enormously successful record. It is, on those terms, on sort of record company terms, you can't criticize the result, but there's no reason to believe that if the record had come out in more indicative form, like in the Butch Vig style, there's no reason to think that it wouldn't have been just as successful, you know. But there's a kind of a procedural judo that record label people did at the time, where no matter what decision the band made, someone else would second guess it and make them do something else.
Right.
The rationale for that is, if it's successful, then the person who made them do something can claim authorship of that success, right? Like, we're having this conversation now about a record that was an enormous success, and someone somewhere is thinking, yeah, the reason that record was successful was because I made them remix it. For sure, someone thinks that. 100%, I'm absolutely certain someone thinks that. Now, if that record had come out and been a failure, or only modestly successful, that same person would be able to say, yeah, we tried everything with that record. We had them remix it the way, the original mixes weren't acceptable. We had them, we did everything on that record, and still it wasn't a success. There's that tier of the record business that sees itself as being above the musician, sort of management and professional class in the music scene, in the music business. They want to claim authorship of all success, and they want to defend against any argument of irresponsibility, right? None of those people would ever say, yeah, I wasn't paying any attention to that band, and that record was a huge success on its own merit. No one would ever say that, right? And as a result, they're sort of defended against any criticism. They can sort of deflect any criticism, and while at the same time they can justify their position. They can garner any appreciation that the record has. They can sort of usurp that for themselves. So I find that whole tier of music business kind of not just baffling but infuriating. And one of the great satisfactions of the collapse of the record business has been that people like that have no place to go now.
Mm.
No one will employ somebody just to second guess a band anymore, whereas that used to be a principal occupation.
Were the band quite receptive to your ideas when you were in the studio with them?
I didn't present them with a lot of ideas.
Right.
Like, we saw the studio space, I suggested like physical layout for the band. We changed that around slightly for a couple of songs for sonic reasons. Generally speaking, the band had, like, Kurt had his plan for overdubs and production pretty well in mind before we got to the studio. Like, he knew that for most of the songs, he was going to be playing the main theme on one of his guitars as he would live on stage. And then he was going to add a second guitar for emphasis, and he had worked out already where that was going to happen on a song-by-song basis. So I didn't have to suggest anything. Like, at no point did I say, how about some harmonies, It's just not my game. I'm not good enough at those aspects of music to suggest that to anybody. I feel like if I was good enough at all of those things, I would just make my own records and be a millionaire,
Well, were there any other bands that you worked with in the studio that you had artistic differences with? Did you ever find a situation where you couldn't work with someone?
Not one. I mean, basically, my job, my professional obligation is to get along with somebody and make a record with them, Like, having artistic differences is not an excuse. Having an artistic difference with somebody means that I'm wrong. Like, let's say you're in a band and you want to make a record and you want it to sound a certain way, and I have an artistic difference with you about that, as an employee of yours. Well, I'm wrong. It's your band. So that sort of thing has never stopped a record cold. The only things that ever really have interfered with a session are when someone's just, obstinate or unreliable to the extent that work stops and you can't finish. And that's really, really rare, like exceedingly rare. I can think of it happening one or two times.
Right.
In, over the course of thousands of records.
So you're quite well known for being quite disciplined. You've got a rigid stance about not taking royalties. Is that the case? You just get paid on a daily basis?
Yeah, but I mean, it's not... it's not a matter of me having like a rigid stance. It's just, I just don't work that way. It's like, yeah, I mean, the principle is that if the band is earning the money, they should keep the money. And that seems perfectly reasonable to me. None of that, I don't even see how that's controversial. The band makes a record, the band makes an audience, finds an audience, that audience buys their record, the band should get the lion's share of that money. That doesn't even seem at all controversial to me. That just seems like a perfectly reasonable position. If I work on a record for a couple of days, pay me for my time, and I'll move on to the next record. You don't have to spend the rest of your life accounting to me and sending me fractional sums of every record you sell. That's fucking ridiculous. That's absurd. Part of that is that period where there was just so much money in music that the people responsible for the money started to think that they were the whole show, And so they were apportioning the money to other people in the music business because that was all they could think of to do with it. It just, and only the barest fraction of it would trickle down to the artists. And I didn't come from that tradition. I didn't come from having worked in the music business my whole career. I was in a band. And so I saw that the reason a band was successful was because the band was good, not because this person or that worked out the contract, or because this person was the A&R person, or because this person insisted they remix it. I know that the ultimate success or failure of a record falls on the shoulders of the band. So it never entered my mind to take a royalty. Let's put it that way.
Right, okay. What are your views on analog recording? Do you still prefer to use that over digital recording?
Yeah, I exclusively work in the analog domain.
Yeah?
Yeah, I own a professional studio, and as a professional obligation, we have to have digital recording for all of our other clients, like all the other engineers and all the staff engineers here that use digital techniques. But for the records that I work on, I still work exclusively in the analog domain. There are a lot of practical reasons for that, but the main one is that the analog master tape is an archival quality permanent master that's good for 100 years or more. And I feel like my principal obligation to the bands that I record is for their music to survive. And there's simply no long-term survivable option for digital recording. I have this conversation, and you could call it an argument, regularly with digital engineers, all of whom have come up with individual case workarounds for a lot of the problems in archiving digital material in a permanent fashion. And every one of those seems like it will work for the individual case under discussion, but doesn't work in a general sense. And so in a general sense, there's no solution. And because of the rapid pace of development of computer platforms and the subsequent rapid change in compatibility of software, it's very difficult to future-proof, or I would say it's impossible to future-proof a digital recording in the way that analog recordings are intrinsically future-proof.
Yeah. Do you think having tracks in a certain order rigidly make the experience a better one, where, instead of cherry-picking?
Yeah, but I think there's always... I think that you can make an album, and then people can choose to listen to it as an album or not. And I think there's still value in making an album as an album. And, I mean, if nothing else, the sole surviving physical format for music is the LP. And that means that in the historical record, when things have fallen off the internet and things are no longer current playlists, if you're going to discover someone's music in the distant future, you're going to do it by finding a physical LP. And I think that's, if for no other reason, I think that's a perfectly valid reason to make an LP or an album that is meant to be heard as a single piece. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Where do you think the record industry is going at the moment? The record sales are sort of dwindling, aren't they?
I mean, there are still people are still becoming very popular within, on a certain platform or through a certain vehicle. Like, there are YouTube channels where people are considered stars, people I will never hear of and never see, but in their idiom or on their platform, they're fucking huge, you know? There are people in the sort of club music world who can command exorbitant fees to do DJ nights where they just turn up and play records that they've curated for other people. I think all of those are, those are legitimate ways for people to consume art and to engage with artists. So I don't poo-poo those at all. I don't particularly care what the music business is doing beyond the stratum of the working musician and the people in bands and people making music. I care quite a bit what those people are doing. And as long as those people want to keep making music, then somebody somewhere will find a way to listen to it. I don't think I need to concern myself with the distribution medium is, with what the end user listener format is. I'm making the historical record, the master tape of the performance that will last for 100 years plus. That's my obligation. At any point along the way, you can release that out into the world on a Bandcamp page, or on a SoundCloud stream, or on in iTunes, or on YouTube, you can press up a record of it. You can, shower the audience with thumb drives of fuck. I don't care. I don't know or care what the ultimate distribution or use of it is going to be. My obligation is to the band at the moment to make sure that their music survives. Mm. And they can do with their music whatever they want. I'm sure that they'll figure out a way to let people listen to it. That's the way that it's always worked.
Yeah.
When, certain avenues don't exist anymore, like the sort of the pop line through the major label apprenticeship, and then the eventual roster artist status. Like, that doesn't really exist anymore. But a much more immediate thing exists where people can really informally get with musicians that they like and admire, and they can interact with them on a personal human level. Like, if somebody posts something up on YouTube, you can send them a message or put something on their Twitter or their Instagram or whatever. You can directly communicate with that person. How fucking cool is that? Yeah. Like, if I was a kid, when I was a kid and I got that first Ramones record and it blew my fucking mind open, if I could, type something into my phone and Johnny Ramone would read it, that would have made me the happiest fucking kid in the world. Yeah. I would have just pestered them relentlessly. So I find it very hard to find fault with these developments, because they are allowing a much more immediate interaction between the band and the audience. Mm. And that immediacy, I think, makes for a very genuine relationship. When somebody posts something on a public-facing page, this is the thing I've done, I'm proud of it, and somebody else reacts to it, dude, that's awful, right? I think those kind of exchanges are great, like when you were, during the vinyl era, before there was the internet, in order for me to hate a record, I would have had to make a special trip into town, sort through all the bins, pick out a record, pay for it, take it home, like hours tied up before I could drop the needle and decide that something sucked. It was hours and, a lot, relatively speaking, a lot of money, in that transaction. And then when I was done, there was no way I could tell him I thought it sucked. Right? I'm just sitting there mute in the basement, like, what the fuck did I buy a factory? What the fuck did I buy a Classics Nouveau record for? Just, like, there's no outlet for the frustration of having just bought a terrible record. Mm. Like, now you can vent immediately to the person that wasted seconds of your time.
Have you ever tried to get in touch with any of them over the internet to discuss their work or anything like that?
No, not in that fashion. Although I have, I was on an early Usenet thing, and I found out that I was conversing with somebody that I admired as a guitar player, and I talked to him for a while. And then I was on a listserv, and I found out that one of my favorite musicians was a member of that listserv, and so I was able to communicate with him that way. And then I got email through just out of the blue from some people, things like that. But I haven't specifically stalked anybody now.
Is there any people that you wish you had worked with in terms of groups?
Oh yeah, sure. Like I would have loved to have done a Link Ray record. I always felt like I could have made a really good Crazy Horse record. I always admired the way AC/DC approached their music. I think I would have enjoyed working on one of their records. A completely different idiom, but I'm a big fan of. There's a 20th century composer named Conlon Nancarrow who composed exclusively for the player piano, and I think his music sounds fucking insane. Love to have had a chance to record one of his player pianos in situ at his place in Mexico. I think that would have been incredible. I admire people like Philip Glass and other people who write for ensembles that in a fashion that sort of breaks the mold. There's an experimental musician named Alvin Lucier who's made a bunch of really incredible, real groundbreaking experimental works. I would have loved to have worked on one of those. There's a lot of stuff that has happened that I would have liked to have done, but I can't complain about the fucking. I got to make records with some of my heroes. I've been able to pay the rent and pay the salaries of a half dozen employees for 20 years plus here at Electrical Audio. I can't complain about anything that has happened to me. I've had a really, really great run of cards, as they say.
Do you think you'll ever retire, or can you see yourself doing this right into your 90s?
Well, there's a practical point there in that I still owe a bunch of money for Electrical Audio and for the house that I live in.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to need to maintain an income to pay off all of my debts, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, I went to the trouble of building an extremely durable studio, and I would like it to survive me. It would be great if Electrical Audio carried on in a kind of an institutional manner after I retire, after I kick off, whatever. So, but I mean, there will come a point when my hearing won't be good anymore, and I won't be able to make records anymore. I mean, I'm trying to maintain awareness of those changes. My stamina already isn't what it used to be. Like, I used to be able to do 18-hour sessions on a trot, like several in a row, or pull a couple of all-nighters if necessary. And I just can't do that anymore. And so my working stamina now sort of peters out after 12 or 14 hours in the studio. And it didn't used to be like that. I used to be able to, an 18, 20-hour day, no big deal. So as my stamina wears out, and everyone's hearing deteriorates as they age. So at some point, my hearing won't be good enough for me to be responsible making records. And now, just the prudent thing will be for me to stop as opposed to carry on just out of habit. I try to maintain. There's one of the guys that works here at Electrical Audio is a guy named Gregoire Yish, and he's a degreed audiologist, and he also works for a company that does hearing aids and testing. And he's been a great resource for me, what I should look out for any changes in my hearing, things of that nature. And there's a method that I employ that I think is probably common to other listening professionals, like other people who have to listen to music professionally. In the same way that, like, the tips of your fingers are more sensitive than the rest of your hand, right? So you can feel more detail with the tips of your fingers, and the center of your vision is more sensitive than the rest of your vision field. You can see more detail in the center of your vision. There's a similar sort of concentrating effect that you can use where you can concentrate your attention on a certain spectrum or a certain detail in the sound. And if you focus your attention on it, you can hear in more detail than you can passively. So what I try to do is I try to maintain awareness of changes by focusing my attention on specific sounds or parts of the spectrum. And so far, I still feel like I have been able to make qualitative judgments that allow me to keep working.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there may very well come a time when I won't feel like it's like I can do that, and then the responsible thing then is for me to quit. You know, I just hope that I don't ruin everything by quitting at a point where we have to close the studio, or quitting at a point where I go broke or whatever. You know, that's a practical concern. You know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all that, Steve. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Oh, no problem.